Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Video files from the wife's friend, so what could be in there? Today's story features a similar plot. Enjoy watching it. Do you know she's cheating on you? Shauna, whom I would undoubtedly call my closest friend in the world, asked me. Her steely blue eyes were glued to my face, giving me no way to escape her statement. In the moments after she blatantly blurted out something that could ruin my day, I didn't know where to look. We were sitting on the back deck of her house, and I sat there, not knowing what to say or how to react. The question she had asked a moment ago was not entirely unexpected, but it still took me by surprise. Before she asked, I was enjoying a quiet day, but in her gaze, in addition to the question, there was a special form of torment that only the two of us could understand. She had to utter these words. After a few seconds of avoiding her gaze, I looked at Shauna and held her gaze for a moment, trying to wish the last 30 seconds could go back. I knew Shauna wouldn't make such a challenge without a reason. I felt the muscles in my shoulders tighten and looked away, glancing up at the cool, gray winter sky. For us coastal natives here in Byron Bay, Australia, it was the coldest time of the year. A cold wind blew off the ocean as we sat on our back patio, dressed in warm sweaters and drinking hot chocolate. As the moment dragged on, I carefully avoided looking at her and watched the clouds. I noted that we were likely to have a couple of showers in a few hours, possibly a good rain, based on how the clouds were moving. Sighing, I picked up my half-empty mug of hot chocolate and continued to watch the cloud formations change shape, occasionally catching a glimpse of the blue sky before it disappeared. I took a deep breath. The sunny sky, like my happiness, seemed to be out of reach. Try as I might, thinking about the weather couldn't distract me from Shauna's uncomfortable words. Holding the mug with its warm, sweet taste, I stopped looking at the clouds and turned my gaze to Maddie, my 8-year-old daughter, who was happily pushing her stepbrother Greg on the swing in Shauna's garden. Several minutes passed without either of us saying a word, and I knew Shauna was waiting for me to process my thoughts. She knew that I had suspected something was wrong for some time. The excuses and snarky comments had made me wonder about my wife. The time away from each other, less flirting, and even a few angry words that had me sleeping in the guest room a few times in recent months had left me depressed and led me to become sullen towards everyone. But everyone knew that I was more of a peacemaker than a fighter, and I avoided conflict as much as possible. This didn't mean I was always a doormat. I stood up for myself and those around me when needed. However, if it involved a personal problem, I tended to put it off in the hope that it would go away. I took another deep breath as I watched Maddie and Greg play, beginning to feel the emotions I had been denying for months welling up in my chest. The knot of stress I had been feeling for a while suddenly made itself known as pain, and I swallowed hard. I looked at Shauna again and saw the look of pain on her face. I knew she didn't want to start anything like that. However, at the same time, if there was anyone in this world who always had my back, it was her. When I looked at her again, I couldn't find the right words. I watched as Shauna hesitantly took an envelope out of her bag. It was one of those big bags that mothers all over the world carry to hold everything they need for their children. I'm sorry, honey. I can't think of a softer way to say this, but Bridget is cheating on you, Shauna told me again. She held the envelope in her hands for a moment. It was about the size of an A3 sheet and looked heavy. I met her gaze again, which combined pity and pain, but she sighed, deciding to follow the chosen path. She slowly moved the envelope onto the table in front of her, her left hand now resting on it. Everything is here. I've been wondering all day what the best thing to do is, but you should know what's going on. Do you want me to give it to you now or later? Pain flashed in her eyes again. She didn't like it at all. She saw the despair on my face. What hurt her was that, with the exception of a few months, she had been my closest friend for most of my life and knew me best. My name is Timothy Otter, of course, everyone calls me Tim. Until that moment, I thought I was fooling myself into thinking I was happily married to Bridget. However, when I looked at the envelope that Shauna had just pulled out, I realized that it contained the truth. My marriage was neither happy nor healthy. Looking back on the last few months, or rather, let's be honest, the last year, there was nothing obvious about it, but I had always doubted Bridget's fidelity. I sighed expressively, looking at the envelope lying under Shauna's hand. Unfortunately, having a wife who cheats was a scenario that had happened to me before. Once again, we sat in silence, saying nothing as I stared at the pile of bad news in Shauna's hand. I didn't want it to be true, but I knew from the look on Shauna's face that whatever was in the envelope was going to hurt me. "How are you?" Shauna asked, my voice shaking slightly as I grabbed the cup with a third of the hot chocolate left, which was quickly cooling. "Rick," she answered quickly and simply. Rick was Shauna's husband, a well-known family solicitor with many connections in Byron Bay, Northern NSW, and Queensland. Rick and I had an interesting relationship. We both loved Shauna and would do anything for her, despite our history, or rather, because of it. Over the years, Rick had also become a good friend of mine. We both continued to look at the envelope. If my suspicions were confirmed and the envelope turned out to be what I thought it was, then Bridget and I would be finished. Rick would turn out to be a better friend than I thought, or he had finally decided to show me that he was not happy with our friendly relationship with Shauna. I stared at the envelope in Shauna's hand for a few more moments and felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I don't think I can go through this again, I thought. "Tim, you won't be alone," Shauna said. She always knew exactly how I felt, but it worked both ways, and I could see that she was holding back her words this time. Considering everything we had been through, we were both only 25. Going through a second divorce before 30 was going to hurt no matter what. The pauses in the conversation were long. She gave me space to realize what was happening. The third time neither of us said a word until Maddie walked up to us, holding 1-year-old Greg in her arms. "Mom, I think Greg needs his diaper changed." "It stinks," she wrinkled her nose, and the smell let us know that the diaper was indeed in need of changing. My daughter, an 8-year-old girl, habitually commented on everything she did. Shauna stood up and, without saying a word, pulled out her bag, taking Greg from Maddie. She glanced at me briefly, and after a moment's hesitation, she picked up the envelope again and nodded to Maddie before meeting my gaze. I nodded in response. Maddie didn't need to see what was inside. Over the next few moments, Maddie quickly settled into my lap, hugged me, and blew me a kiss while Shauna took her son to get his diaper changed. "Dad, are you okay?" Maddie asked. "I mean, you don't look normal. What did you and Mom just talk about?" She had an idea, based on the expression on my face, that I just couldn't hide. "You're not fighting again like when I was little, are you?" This thought scared my daughter. For as long as she could remember, her mom and I hadn't been a couple, but in her head, we had always been best friends. A few years ago, she had asked why we weren't together if we loved each other as much as we told her. Shauna and I began to tell Maddie more and more as she grew, but she was clearly worried after hearing several stories that we might have a fight. You see, Shauna and I were once married. We met in 3rd grade and became best friends within a week. Our friendship led to dating when hormones made themselves felt, and then, without thinking about the consequences of being adults but still so young, we allowed ourselves to become pregnant. Our parents were horrified but supported us. We were young and thought it was right to get married, so we did, right after Maddie was born. It turns out we shouldn't have done that. Yes, Shauna and I were best friends, but being married to each other was not the right fit for our friendship. I admit that after Maddie was born and the wedding, there was love. The intim was wonderful, and from the outside, we seemed like a young couple in love with each other. But a series of small troubles accumulated, ultimately destroying us. No matter how hard we tried, we simply could not be married to each other. One of the things that ruined us was that I'm a programmer and a gamer. I started my first business at 16, was married with a child at 18, and worked 80 to 90 hours a week during that time. I spent as much time as I could with Shauna and Maddie, but it just wasn't enough for her. As I said, these were small things. For most people, stress related to children and work begins in their 20s or even 30s. It happened to Shauna and me when we were 18. Although they supported us outwardly, neither of our parents believed that we could handle it and forced both of us to sign a prenuptial agreement before we got married. My parents insisted on it because they were giving me startup capital. Shauna's parents insisted because if my business failed, they didn't want their daughter to be involved in it. The business was going well, it didn't fail. But 2 years later, I created a new business and incorporated the first into it, creating other gaming ventures. Even in my early 20s, I had 50 employees in 3 different countries. This included programmers, testers, marketers, and more than a few administrative staff. Overall, my gaming company generated approximately $180 million in annual revenue through a series of mostly free-to-play games with microtransactions built into them. Microtransactions are when you buy something in a game to give you an advantage over others. You can buy additional resources, time, or bonuses. Our earnings are modest compared to some gaming companies, but that's not something to complain about, and we've never had a fiscal quarter that our investors didn't like. Going back to those early days, Shauna and I loved our child, were best friends, and had an amazing night, but ultimately the only way I can describe it is that we just didn't love each other on a soulmate level. As I mentioned, it was the little things that destroyed us, the very things you forgive when you truly love your spouse. If not, they drive you crazy. The destruction of our marriage was inevitable because I was busy with business and wasn't around as much as I needed to be, which accelerated our breakup. Although perhaps the speed of destruction also saved our friendship, it all piled up as we fought over chores, my time at work, and taking care of Maddie. On the work side, one day I had a late meeting with some of my investors, and I forgot to tell Shauna about it. Shauna didn't inform me that she wanted me to come to Maddie's daycare appointment, so when I got home, she was angry, and I didn't understand why. We shouted at each other for almost half an hour. Eventually, Shauna stormed out of the house, telling me to make my own dinner and screaming at me to be a responsible parent and look after our daughter. She then called her friends, got blackout drunk, and woke up the next morning in the bed of some random guy she picked up at a bar. In Shauna's defense, she never lied to me or tried to hide what she had done. Even though she was in tears and regretting her actions, she returned home the next day upset and remorseful. But as a young guy listening to her tell me what she had done, my world came crashing down around me as my best friend and wife humiliated me. Without thinking, I verbally attacked her, calling her a woman of easy virtue. Shauna recoiled for a moment and then responded venomously, calling me a pathetic nerd and a worthless father who had never been there for her or our daughter. As soon as the insults left her lips, she knew she had made a mistake. She was the one who stormed out of the house and slept with someone else. We both knew I didn't mean what I said, but her reaction and implied anger felt like an arrow to the heart. Regardless, I had been her best friend for as long as either of us could remember, and she knew it. Tim, she tried to say, putting her hands to her lips in horror. I looked at her sadly, raised my hand, and just walked away. I immediately moved into the guest room. Over the next few months, I'm sure our screams could probably be heard in the neighboring area. Of course, I was offended, so I started divorce proceedings for adultery, citing the prenuptial agreement. When she was given a summons to go home while I was at work, Shauna did not go through the normal counseling procedures. Over the next few weeks, she alternated between being remorseful, asking for forgiveness, and when I didn't tell her I forgave her, she would get angry and yell at me, calling me a weakling, no good in bed, and the biggest mistake of her life. Every time we were in the same room for more than 30 seconds, she started crying again. The only time we didn't fight was when we were around Maddie, and even then it was tense. In the end, it was our parents who intervened, saying, "We told you so," and helped us. I came home one evening to find all four of us in the living room, Shauna crying and upset, our mothers talking to her in quiet tones. Both fathers took me aside and scolded me a little, although they understood that I was the injured party. We eventually carried out an intervention in which all 6 of us participated. They spoke convincingly and made us both feel guilty for 3 hours, scolding us one by one. When they left us alone later to talk, neither Shauna nor I said anything for 15 minutes. But as soon as we started talking, everything broke down, including the pain and suffering. Despite her cheating, which hurt both of us, for the first time, we talked without yelling at each other. I believed her when she explained that she would never have done this if she hadn't been drunk and angry. "I'm so sorry, Tim," Shauna said, wiping tears from her eyes. "I never meant to hurt you like that. I shouldn't have left that night." "I shouldn't have," I replied. "You shouldn't have done what I did," she added, taking a deep breath. "I disrespected you greatly, and I was stupid when I took out my anger on you for my own betrayal." I smiled sadly. "I'm sorry, Shauna. It hurts, and I can't say it's gone. You are my closest friend. I should have forgiven you." Shauna touched my cheek sadly. "Thanks, Tim. "But what do we do now?" she asked. We talked further for several hours. We agreed that if we wanted to remain friends and restore trust in each other, we could no longer be married. For the first time in months, she cried in my arms. Although we no longer made love or slept in the same bed, we spent a lot of time together over the next few days. We agreed that co-parenting as friends rather than as spouses was the right decision. The divorce was finalized over the next 18 months, and gradually, Shauna and I became best friends again. We decided to bury the grudges, and in the ashes of our marriage, we realized that we were as close as before, and maybe even closer. Slowly, we opened up to each other like in the early days of our relationship. We exchanged hugs and even the occasional chaste kiss, but our romantic love faded with the divorce. Was I sad? Yes, I still loved Shauna with all my heart, but I would rather have her as a friend in my life than destroy each other by being married and unable to trust. Bridget and I started dating a little less than a year after our divorce, a week after Maddie's 4th birthday. Bridget was working with Shauna at the time, and that's how we met. Bridget had been hinting at a date for months, and when it became obvious that Shauna and I were done, she took the initiative and asked me out. I asked Shauna how she would feel about me dating Bridget. She reluctantly gave her consent, but I could see that she was hurt that I was starting to date. After the first few dates, I would often find Shauna at my door with Maddie the next day, and I would invariably tell her how my dates with Bridget went. She was a true friend and did not judge me in those early days. She supported me in every possible way, even when tears welled up in her eyes. Within 3 months of my first date with Bridget, she invited me into her bed. From the moment she invited me into her bed, I knew Bridget was different. About 6 months later, she admitted that she was falling in love with me and not just wanting me. Bridget opened up and told me that around the same time Shauna and I were going through a divorce, she was getting out of a long-term relationship that she described as intense but unhealthy. Because Bridget and I had dated several times while I was with Shauna, she looked at me as someone kind and loving who would take care of her, unlike her previous boyfriend, who had only used and abused her. Bridget was short but fit, she had large but toned calves, and her stomach almost had a woman's abs, thanks to the hours she spent in the gym. I loved that Bridget had healthy, C-cup breasts. After that, Bridget moved in with me, and things seemed to get even better. She was fun to be with, always laughing and asking how my day was. She loved going out but also didn't mind when I wanted to stay home and cuddle. About a year after we moved in together, Bridget started hinting at marriage. This time, I quickly took the hint and asked her to marry me. 8 months later, we got married. It would have happened sooner, however, she tried to persuade me to renounce the prenuptial agreement, which was a condition of our marriage. My legal team pushed for a defense, and the chairman of my board of directors flew from Sydney to meet us and explain why a prenuptial agreement had to be in place or there would be no wedding. We almost broke up over this after several heated discussions, but in the end, after the chairman of the board left, she signed the documents. Other gaming was gaining momentum and attention around the world with several of my new games, so my corporate lawyers and board of directors got their way. While Bridget and I were getting ready for our wedding, Shauna also met Rick. As much as I wanted to hate him, I couldn't. Rick was friendly and a couple of years older than Shauna and me. When I saw them together, I noticed that they were perfect for each other, complementing each other in a way that I never could. Unlike how Bridget and I started, things were slow for Rick and Shauna, their intimacy developing gradually. When Shauna pointed this out to me, we had several serious conversations in which we agreed to discuss our jealousy towards our partners to avoid going back to a state where we weren't in each other's lives. As Bridget and I, and Rick and Shauna grew as couples, everyone knew not to come between Shauna and me. For example, in the early days of Rick and Shauna's relationship, he and I almost got into a fight over a few things. Well, that's not entirely true. He hit me once when he caught Shauna hugging me after I dropped Maddie off. By then, they were already engaged, and Bridget and I were married. Shauna told them to stop being jealous because I was already married, her best friend, and Maddie's father. If he can't handle it, then let him pack his things and leave. 6 months later, I was best man at their wedding. Overall, it was a little surreal how our relationships turned out. It was always understood that Shauna and I were inseparable, and with Maddie, that wasn't going to change. Once Rick got over his feelings, we became close friends and confidants as he realized I loved his wife, but in the wrong way. At the same time, Bridget and Shauna developed an easy friendship. They weren't exactly best friends, but they would sometimes hang out together while Rick and I played golf or went out with Maddie. Back in the present, I leaned over and kissed my curious daughter on the cheek as she stole a piece of chocolate from the muffin I never got around to eating. "No, honey," I told Maddie, trying to find the right way to explain to the 8-year-old that her dad's wife, but not her mom, was cheating on him. "Mom and I don't fight. She's just telling me something that I think will be complicated." I finished, trying to find the right words. "It has to do with Bridget, doesn't it?" Maddie asked defiantly. I stared at her, and she snorted, like a typical teenage girl who thinks she knows everything. She looked at my face and added, "I thought so." "Maddie," I frowned, "you have to respect Bridget. I understand she's not your mom, but you like Rick, and he's not your dad." She snorted again, now dealing with the muffin, which I was clearly ignoring. "Yes, but Rick respects your relationship with your mom and adores her, and Bridget doesn't like mom or me, and she doesn't respect you." I sat there a little stunned. I just couldn't understand how I hadn't noticed it. Bridget and I had been together for 4 years, almost 3 of them married. Given what I knew about the contents of the envelope that Shauna was about to show me and the words of my 8-year-old daughter, a lot of things fell into place. Little things that I had turned a blind eye to, how Bridget acted towards me, how she treated Shauna and Maddie. Taking an introspective look at everything, I saw the small acts of disrespect and how I allowed them to happen. After the failure of my marriage to Shauna, I wanted this marriage to work with Bridget, so I was more passive and forgiving than I should have been. Bridget probably knew it. We sat in silence for a few minutes while Maddie finished her muffin and Shauna returned with Greg, who had already had his diaper changed. Shauna looked at me and asked Maddie to take Greg out to play again so she and I could continue our conversation. Maddie started to protest, but Shauna used her mom voice. There is no arguing with a mother's voice. We both looked at our daughter as she walked back into the garden with Greg. "She understands almost everything, Tim. Maddie is too smart and sees things she shouldn't see at her age," Shauna said as she watched Maddie leave with her brother. I snorted as I watched my stepbrother and sister set up in the sandbox. Maddie started digging a hole, and Greg decided it would be fun to fill it back in with sand. "This must be from you. I miss everything, don't I?" I said sadly. I looked at the woman I had loved for so many years, and who, despite everything that had happened, I still loved in many ways. Even though I had not yet seen the contents of the envelope, I felt despair. A few moments later, Shauna was back in the chair next to me, her arms suddenly wrapped around me, comforting me, and we both let a few tears escape. If I was honest with myself, I knew that Bridget hadn't loved me at the right level for some time. I knew there were too many things that just weren't adding up. I saw an envelope sticking out of Shauna's bag, so I pulled it out and sat down next to her again. I was about to open the envelope, but Shauna put her hand on mine. "Tim," she said, making me look at her, "nothing that's in there will bring you anything but pain. Understand?" She had obviously already looked inside. I nodded. I swallowed, and not knowing what else to do, opened the envelope from which 2 documents fell out, as well as a USB drive. The first document was a detailed report with dates, times, and places where Bridget was tracked, as well as transcripts of conversations that were recorded on the USB. The drive contained a combination of audio and video recordings that left no doubt. I quickly skimmed the truthful report. If the first document broke my heart with Bridget cheating on me, as I flipped through the various pages, the second one sent my heart flying through the air like a clay target caught by a shotgun blast. The second document contained photo after photo of Bridget with another man identified as Brad, her ex. In the photographs, it all started with harmless meetings over coffee, then turned into more intimate ones, and then a depraved scene began. Some photos were taken from afar, others had an angle as if they were taken with a hidden camera, clearly exposing the unfaithful wife. I sighed bitterly as I returned the documents and USB drive back to the envelope, feeling empty inside, even though I knew it would hit me hard later. "Why?" I asked, feeling something die inside me. Shauna didn't say anything. I think she felt some of the pain that was in my question. "Tim," she began, but fell silent. I turned to look at my old friend, the mother of my daughter, my ex-wife, and my first betrayer. What's wrong with me? I asked, feeling a tightness in my chest. Shauna looked shocked at my question. I mean, am I really that pathetic that the women I love have to cheat on me? The moment I said those words, I regretted them. Shauna's reaction was immediate. Her kiss on my cheek was followed by her arms wrapping around my neck as she started crying. I just sat there, feeling betrayed. After a moment, she looked at me. Tim, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I stopped her. No, it's me, Shauna, I answered despondently. I shouldn't have said that. This is unfair, and I regret comparing it to what happened here. I'm sorry I asked. She pulled away, smiled sadly, and then kissed my forehead. Certainly. Well, what do we have here? We suddenly heard another voice. It looks very cozy, said the voice, turning to the new arrival. We saw Rick, who was trying to look serious but was not very successful, with a smile on his face. He noticed the envelope in my hands, and his smile changed from playful to sad. Oh, he said, making no attempt to separate Shauna and me. Instead, he came and sat in the chair on the other side of me, placing his hand on my shoulder and squeezing it. Sorry, buddy. I decided to take it upon myself. Both Shauna and Maddie had said things that made me think, so a couple of months ago, I started doing something about it. The private detective I hired had worked for me more than once. I received the report only yesterday, he said quietly, with sincere sympathy on his face. Have you watched it yet? I asked. Rick shook his head. No, I didn't watch it at all. I just glanced at the detective's report when we picked it up. He looked at his wife. But judging by your reactions, you both have already read it. Shauna and I nodded. Rick sighed and leaned back in his chair. So, what's next? He asked. I shrugged. Divorce. We were silent. All three of us looked at the sandbox. Little Greg was already sitting in the hole Maddie had dug, and my daughter filled it back in while Greg laughed periodically. She glanced in our direction but then turned her attention back to Greg, realizing that now was the time for adult conversations. Despite the serious nature of the discussion, all three of us were smiling. Honey, Shauna said to Rick, it would be appropriate if you... She trailed off. Introducing Tim, he asked, finishing her question. Shauna nodded. Yes, I can do it. Tim, would you be okay with me being your lawyer? Rick asked seriously, switching to lawyer mode. I nodded. Yes. I handed the envelope to Rick. You'll need this. He pushed the envelope back. This is your copy. I assumed this would be your decision, and I already have a copy on my desk in the office. Marriage contract? He asked. I pulled my phone from my pocket, quickly found the document, and emailed the prenuptial agreement Bridget, and I signed to my new family law attorney. I chuckled. I sent information to my ex-wife's husband. Shauna looked at me in surprise. Why are you laughing? My divorce lawyer will tear my unfaithful wife to pieces, I said, and Rick smiled that lawyer smile that resembles the grin of a shark ready to swallow its prey. Married to my ex-wife, whom I technically divorced for adultery and enforced the prenuptial agreement. No one said a word for a minute, and I wondered if I had gone too far. But a moment later, Shauna hugged me, laughing. Rick slapped me on the back. At least you still have a sense of humor, Rick said ironically. We spent the next half hour discussing my next steps. Bridget will be spending the week with her mother on the Gold Coast. She'll be there for at least another 5 nights, I said as we worked out the plan. The look Rick gave me and then Shauna said a lot. Most likely, Bridget was not with her mother at all. Well, I said quietly, I guess I deserve it. But this will give me time to take action. Knowing that my wife was not with her mother added a little pain to the overall picture, like icing on a cake of troubles. We talked for a few more minutes, and then Maddie returned to the table with Greg as the sun began to set. Half an hour later, after many hugs and kisses from my daughter, I headed home in my all-white 2016 Mustang. My Mustang was the first new car I bought, a reward for reaching $5 million in income. The board gave me a budget and was surprised when I spent less than half on the Mustang. I got home and parked, the large security gate closing as I pulled into the garage. The house was owned by a subsidiary of Other Gaming and was rented to me as part of an executive benefits package. At the time, this was the way to get a large, modern home, the house that Bridget wanted. All I needed was a good workspace for my computer and a bed to sleep in, but the house was still nice, with 5 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, and a terrace overlooking the ocean in the distance. I had one of the bedrooms set up as a computer and game room. Maddie had her own bedroom, decorated to suit her 8-year-old tastes, and of course, Bridget and I had a large bedroom overlooking the ocean. We had lived in this house for only 6 months, but during that time, we managed to hold a couple of parties and bless almost every room in the house, as befits a young married couple. I wondered if she had brought Brad here. The thought made me nauseous. I walked into the kitchen, throwing my bag and the envelope with information about Bridget and Brad onto the kitchen table. I immediately headed to the pantry, where I returned with a bottle of Bundaberg rum and took a cold can of Coke from the refrigerator. After pouring myself a double helping, I took the envelope, pulled out my laptop, and readied it to view the contents on the USB drive while I read the report in more detail. Reading the report, I learned that Bridget and Brad had been together before she and I started dating but broke up a few months before that. When I calmed down and began to carefully read the report, it coincided with what I knew about Bridget's breakup. We didn't talk about it much, and the private investigator confirmed what I knew: the gap between them wasn't healthy to begin with. I went on to read that they didn't communicate until Bridget and I were getting ready for our wedding. Less than 3 months after our honeymoon, my loving wife resumed her intimate relationship with her ex-partner. The detective's report contained pages and pages of conversation transcripts, detailed chats about their time together, discussions of the past, and plans for the future. In other words, it was a complete romantic relationship. I sat and read some of their conversations in detail, feeling almost sick at the level of betrayal from my loving wife. But the part of the report that stuck out to me the most was the transcript of the conversation between the two after they finished having an intim in Brad's apartment just a month ago. I found the corresponding video file on the USB drive and pressed play when I connected it to the laptop. "But Bridget, baby," Brad said in a plaintive voice, "why don't you leave this loser and come back to me? You spend almost as much time in my bed as you do in his. You know that I make you much happier." Bridget laughed. "Brad, honey, yes, I love you so much, but he has 2 things that you don't have." "And what is this?" he asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Brains and money," Bridget answered simply. Brad snorted. "It's true, honey," Bridget said, admonishingly. "Tim has a lot of money, so I can use this money as long as I am his wife. And Tim is smart, he's always moving forward. His company is worth a lot, and he's still going strong. That's why when Shauna left him, I took my chance. She had no idea what it would cost." Brad snorted again. "Then why don't you just divorce him and we'll both enjoy whatever money you get?" "Brad, your muscles are in the wrong place. Tim's lawyer made me sign a prenuptial agreement. If I leave him before the 10th year of our marriage, I will get very little. Even if I leave later, I'll still only get a fraction of what it's worth. What's worse is that we need to be careful. If Tim ever catches us, well, for the next few years, I'll only be leaving with the clothes I'm wearing," Bridget explained to Brad without much emotion. Then she smiled and continued, "But that's how we both win. I get money to take us both somewhere, and we continue to have an intim regularly." "But you're still sleeping with him," Brad said plaintively. "That's because I'm his wife," Bridget exclaimed, clearly annoyed. "Listen, Brad, honey, if I don't sleep with him, if I don't keep up the appearance of being a good wife, then this whole thing," she gestured around, pointing at the house. "Tim doesn't know it, but he owns this house. You don't want to lose a place you don't pay a penny for, right?" "I guess not," Brad grumbled, dissatisfied. "But I don't like you sleeping with him if you don't love him." Bridget laughed again. "Oh, my poor baby. I think of Tim fondly in many ways, but he's just a tool for me to achieve what I want." Then her smile turned predatory. The camera only caught the profile of her face, but a chill ran down my spine as I watched her and heard her next words. "You know what, baby? Tim and I were talking about children recently. How do you like this idea? When I stop taking the pills, We will marry your child to him. Will it be easier for you? And then, when the kid turns 18 and can inherit Tim's money, you tell Tim it's your kid, not his, before he accidentally dies. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. I didn't sleep well that night after watching the video of this conversation and reading the report and several others like it. I tossed and turned, my mind imagining dream after dream of Bridget and Brad together. I managed to fall asleep, but I suddenly woke up around 8:30 to the phone ringing. I had a hard time finding the call button. "Hello?" I said sleepily. I heard laughter. "Hey, big guy. Are you sleeping while I'm away?" my wife said cheerfully. I hesitated for a moment, not knowing how to react. Should I immediately blame her or pretend that I didn't know anything? Bridget noticed my hesitation. "Tim, are you okay?" she asked. I couldn't tell if her concern was genuine or feigned. Now, I assumed it was feigned. I decided not to reveal what I knew. I didn't want to see her, so I suppressed my feelings, realizing that everything would soon become clear. "Sorry, late night working on some tough questions," I replied. "Oh honey, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, I'll be back Monday night, so you can tell me everything. And then maybe we can start working on that baby we were talking about," my traitorous wife said happily, practically confirming that she was going to let Brad do it this weekend. "Of course," I answered without enthusiasm. "Tim?" There was a note of doubt in her voice, as if she thought I suspected something. "Are you sure you're okay?" I sighed. "Yes, Bridget. Your call woke me up, and I didn't sleep well." "I'm just a little crazy," I replied, trying to sound normal. She hesitated. "Damn it. Okay, honey, I'll bring you something nice from here on the Gold Coast." "Okay, sounds good, Bridget." "Have fun," I replied, trying to sound like a loving husband. I heard Bridget exhale. Apparently, she bought it. "Okay, my hot and handsome husband. Talk to you later." "Love you." "Goodbye," I said, and hung up before she could say anything more. The baby comment pissed me off, and I spent the next few hours raging about how she was sleeping with Brad, trying to get pregnant, and then planning to pass it off as mine. I was furious. I spent the rest of the day doing what you do in cases of betrayal. I went online and cut off Bridget's access to my bank accounts, canceled our joint credit cards, and called my accountant and corporate lawyer, asking them to remove her from my insurance and will. I wrote several emails introducing Rick to my corporate team to tie everything together. The net quickly tightened around Bridget, and in a dark way, the thought made me smile. Around noon, Rick and Shauna arrived at my place with food. They brought fried chicken, fresh bread, hot potatoes, and some salad. Maddie took Greg to her room, and they played while Shauna cooked dinner and Rick and I talked. "Thanks for the introductory letter," Rick told me, frowning, "but I've got to say, you don't look like you slept well last night." I shook my head. No, I hardly slept, and when I finally fell asleep, I had nightmares. Rick nodded. "So when do you want to start the process? Is Monday too early?" I explained what I wanted to do, and Rick smiled. "No, we can arrange it," he replied, "but I'll have to leave my family here with you and go to the office for a few hours to get everything done. Are you willing to pay a little more for this? I'll give you the family rate, but my boss will still charge you for working on weekends." I shrugged off his words. "No problem. I want this done quickly." I spent several hours reviewing the detective's report and video. What I read and watched last night made me feel sick. I mean, she's having a night with that idiot Brad, trying to get pregnant so she can pass it off as mine before causing an accident with me when the kid turns 18. Rick's eyes widened, obviously still not seeing the details. Even Shauna, who was sitting with a plate of sandwiches, looked upset. "You are sure?" she asked. "Yeah, she stopped taking the pills, and I watched a video of her convincing Brad that she would." I let my shoulders drop. "Don't worry, Tim. We'll make sure she doesn't come back here again," Rick said. "I will also be filing a restraining order against both of them, which will be filed Monday morning. I'll stay here with the kids and help you pack Bridget's things," Shauna said. I had lunch, and the food in my stomach made me feel a little better. When Rick went to the office, I went to the storage room and pulled out a few boxes that we hadn't yet thrown out since we moved 6 months ago, dragging them into the master bedroom. Over the next few hours, Shauna and I packed most of Bridget's clothes, toiletries, and hygiene products. I collected about a third of her jewelry in a bag, the one she had before our wedding. I decided to keep the rest for myself. I boxed up a few of her pairs of shoes but left most of them behind. I didn't know what I would do with them. Perhaps I'd give them to a homeless shelter. I made numerous calls throughout the day to get everything organized, and Rick called me 3 times to follow up on the details. The last 2 calls sounded more somber, and I realized that he had begun to study the evidence collected by the private investigator. For some reason, as the day wore on, I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed that I didn't hear a word from Bridget. When Rick returned that evening with takeout, his mood was somber. He hugged me tightly, expressing his regrets. At that moment, I realized that he was a real friend and not just my best friend's husband. I handed him a sticker with a 6-digit code. "What is this?" he asked, looking at the sticker. "That's the new gate code," I said. I reset the system, giving everyone a new code and removing Bridget's access. "Great," Rick replied. We talked some more, and then he excused himself and went to find his son while Shauna and I started eating dinner. Dinner passed in silence, and they decided to stay the night, then stayed for most of Sunday, leaving only after lunch. I spent a lot of time with Rick discussing the divorce process. When Shauna and I were divorcing, there wasn't much to share since other gaming was just starting to develop. However, I always made sure that as my business became successful, Shauna and Maddie received much more than the legal requirement for child support. But in Bridget's case, the betrayal was deep and deliberate. I wasn't going to do anything extra for her. There was a lot more at stake this time, and I wasn't going to let Bridget get anything. I was sure she would freak out, and Shauna noticed this when we discussed it on Sunday morning. "I don't think she ever loved you, Tim," Shauna said, putting down the private investigator's report. "I'm sorry I didn't say this sooner, and to be honest, Bridget always seemed a little different to me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I may be your best friend, but with our story..." I nodded. "I hope that everything would be fine for you. I know you loved her and let her have her way, but you let her take you where she wanted," Shauna said quietly, looking me straight in the eyes. "I'm not henpecked," I answered sharply. Shauna laughed. "No, you're not henpecked, and that's not what I meant. I mean you don't mind when people lead you to the next step. If you don't want to do something, you just go your own way." Bridget tried to take advantage of this through Intim. Sooner or later, the house of cards would collapse, and I'm glad it happened before she got pregnant. We talked a little more, and a few minutes later, Maddie came back into the room, leading Greg by the arms as he walked, happy as little ones do when they get everyone's attention. We entertained the kids for the next 15 minutes until Rick went into the living room and played a movie for them. Maddie noticed this all the time. Shauna noted, as they left the room, she never really loved Bridget, and no one dares hurt her dad. I can tell you that for sure. "Except her mom," I said jokingly, which earned me a slap on the arm. "Tim," Shauna said, and I felt the atmosphere in the room change. I looked at my ex-wife and saw a sad expression on her face. She sighed. "I know we've talked about this before, but I'm sorry it didn't work out," Shauna told me. "Just because it didn't work out, I hope you know that doesn't mean I love you any less." I nodded, suddenly feeling a lump in my throat. Shauna continued, "You are my best friend, Timothy. We created a beautiful little girl together. We went through hell and almost lost each other, but you showed true character by not punishing me when you had the chance." "But Shauna," I started to say, but she cut me off. "No, Tim, you didn't," she told me. "Yes, we yelled and swore at each other. I did something I'm very ashamed of, and yes, I called you a lot of hurtful names when we were getting divorced. But not once did you treat me badly. You never gave me any reason to think that you were anything other than an honorable man." Rick returned and sat next to Shauna, hugging his wife and nodding at the end of her sentence. "Shauna told me a lot about what you went through back then," Rick said, lost in thought. "Tim, as a lawyer, I can count on one hand the number of people I trust in this world, and you are one of them. When Shauna told me to put our little differences out of my mind, I saw you in a completely different light. You never intended to steal my girl from me. You just wanted to get your best friend back and raise your daughter. When I realized that, something changed in me. You were an honest man who just wanted to do the right thing. Rick looked at me. Tim, I heard your comment earlier. You are in no way submissive. I've watched you argue with Shauna over issues that I wouldn't even discuss with her. Shauna smiled at her husband's comment, then nodded at me. I've heard stories of you telling off your staff for doing something you told them not to do. You're an alpha male, but the difference is that you play by your own rules, not someone else's. Most alpha males are swayed by the fear of missing out, but you are not. Get to the point, honey, Shauna said. You're back in lawyer mode. Rick and I laughed. My point, Rick said, looking at Shauna, is that, Tim, you're going to go through a lot of trouble getting rid of Bridget. But you need to know that it's not your fault. You were an attentive husband, and she took advantage of it. It will be her loss, not yours. We calmed down a bit after that, and Shauna offered to let Maddie stay with me this week to keep me company. But after a moment, I said no. If things went badly with Bridget, I didn't want Maddie to get hurt. On Monday morning, I went into the office to work with several managers on various projects. We plan to release a new game within the next 6 months that would combine augmented reality across multiple platforms. It would be fun if my personal life didn't get in the way. I returned home early in the day and began pacing nervously, waiting for a confrontation to begin. A little later, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone rang. Tim, honey, my code doesn't work for the gate, Bridget said in an overly sweet voice. I can't get into the house. I know, I answered simply and coldly. What do you mean, no? There was a slight alarm in her voice. I took a deep breath. I know everything, Bridget. I know about Brad. I know about your plan to get pregnant and pass the baby off as mine and the accident you planned. I know you don't work every Tuesday and Thursday. I know that you live with Brad in an apartment that you made me pay for. I know your disrespect for me, and I know that, first of all, you don't love me. She said nothing, considering my words. I didn't wait for her answer. I know your code doesn't work, Bridget, because I took away your access to my house. You don't live here anymore, I finished. But Tim, how can you say that? I love you, honey. Bridget's words were sickly sweet, but there was fear in them. Don't forget I was the one who supported you when that Shauna left you. I was the one who took you to bed and loved you all these 4 years. How can you say such nasty things? Easy, I spat into the phone, letting my anger at her betrayal surface for the first time. I stood at the window, looking at her standing at the gate alone, and then I noticed cars approaching. Turn around, Bridget. She turned around, and I heard her sigh. I heard 2 short conversations echoing through the phone. Mrs. Bridget Arthur? Asked the man. Yes, Bridget answered in a trembling voice. You have been served a summons, the guy said. It didn't have to be that way, he continued. The envelope contains a petition for divorce, a prenuptial agreement between you and your husband, and a notice to vacate the apartment owned by your husband, you and Mr. Brad Ton, within 10 days. My client notes that any resistance will result in the withdrawal of any financial proposal he is willing to negotiate outside of the prenuptial agreement, and he will sue you for mental anguish. The final document is a restraining order that will take effect tonight. With that, he turned around, got back into the car, and drove away. It was worth the money I paid Rick. Bridget's next conversation was with an elderly woman who got out of the car, Mirren, her mother. Mom, Tim, she began but fell silent when her mother hit her. A woman of easy virtue, said Mirren. I know enough about what you did to that poor man. I've never been so disappointed in anyone in my life. Mom, I don't know what Tim told you, but it's not true. Bridget protested, holding her cheek. For a moment, I thought the old woman would hit her daughter again, but my mother-in-law turned around and walked back to her car, opening the door. Leave it, Bridget, Mirren told her. Tim showed me one of the photos he has. I know the truth. You have nowhere to go, and Tim asked that your father and I take you in. I can't believe you got involved with that Brad again. Compared with Tim, he's an absolute loser, her mother spat. I was still listening through the open phone. Tim was kind enough to have all your things moved to us. If it were up to me, I would have burned them. Sit down, Bridget's mother finished, ignoring her daughter's protests. It was then that Bridget realized that our conversation was still ongoing. She brought the phone back to her ear. Tim, my soon-to-be ex-wife, said hesitantly. Bridget, I said without emotion. Nothing can be fixed here. Right, she said, with despair and hope in her voice. I half-heartedly laughed. Not a chance. Follow the instructions in the divorce document, and everything will be fine. I am willing to be fair beyond the prenuptial agreement, but if you ever go against me, I will make sure that you have nothing left, including your respect. I stopped, and we were both silent for a few moments. I loved you, Bridget, I told her quietly. But you threw that love away because you didn't love me. You're a gold digger. Oh, and also, Bridget, I said, preparing for my final blow. I heard silence and realized that she was holding her breath. Take a pregnancy test. If you're pregnant, we both know it's not my baby. If you're really pregnant and try to dispute paternity, I will drag you through such mud that even your grandchildren will feel defiled. I finished abruptly. I heard her sob as I hung up. I must admit I felt better, though empty, but better. The next month was an emotional roller coaster. I threw myself into work or spent time with Maddie to take my mind off things. But when I fell asleep, the dreams were unpleasant, and I woke up several times cursing like a sailor. Bridget hired a lawyer and was in contact with Rick. Rick thought they were going to challenge the prenuptial agreement and demand the traditional 50-50 split. However, nothing had happened yet. I gave Rick the authority to offer $30,000 as a settlement, and so far, they hadn't said anything. However, over the weekend, everything changed. I took Maddie to the beach, and we enjoyed ice cream while sitting on the pavement in front of one of those little fish and chip shops that were built in the 80s. You've probably seen them on TV. Buildings made of old beige bricks with a tin roof, the floors covered with linoleum, and the air filled with the smell of frying oil. There were plastic tables and chairs outside, and the atmosphere was casual. Everyone wore swimsuits or bikinis with towels over their shoulders or surfboards under their arms. Maddie and I went for a swim, both loving the waves. We swam, washed off the salt water in a fresh shower outside, and then sat like father and daughter on light blue and yellow plastic chairs, enjoying ice cream. The weather was cool, coming out of winter, but in Byron Bay, if the sun is shining, the water is nice even if it's a little chilly outside. Maddie and I were having a good time talking about how to catch a wave when suddenly Brad attacked us. I fainted. When I woke up sometime later, I saw that a crowd had gathered around us, and Maddie was crying, holding me tightly and calling me daddy. Brad was nowhere to be seen. Someone in the crowd told me they had called the paramedics, and the ambulance and police were on their way. With difficulty overcoming the pain in my back and arm, I slowly sat up and asked for the phone and keys that were lying on the table in front of me. The elderly man looked at me with regret. Sorry, son, but that guy, after he caught your girl, stood motionless for about 10 seconds and then turned around, grabbed your phone and keys, and ran away. I swallowed and nodded. Could you bring my daughter's bag? I asked the man. He looked at the young man and nodded. A moment later, a young man about my age returned with Maddie's bag. I took out her phone. I bought her an iPhone for her birthday this year. It was locked, but she was allowed to call me or Shauna anytime. I dialed Shauna's number. She answered on the third ring. Well, hello, beauty. How are you? Is Dad a good swimmer? I heard her joyful voice. Shauna, I said, wincing as another wave of pain shot through my back. Tim. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up when Shauna realized that something was wrong with me and that I was calling Maddie from my phone. We got hurt, Shauna. Maddie is with me, and she's showing incredible courage right now, I said. Maddie looked at me, her eyes red and her face a mask of discomfort. I heard sirens in the distance. They were quickly approaching. I don't have much time. The police and ambulance are on their way, but I need you to call Naden and ask her to track my phone. Time is of the essence. Naden was my executive assistant. What's wrong, Tim? Is Maddie okay? I I heard the pain in her voice, the same anguish that a mother experiences for her child when she cannot do anything. She's here with me. She's the bravest girl I've ever met. I smiled despite my pain at my daughter, who was crying again but trying not to make any noise. It was Brad Hatan. He attacked me and then tried to push Maddie away when she came between us while I was on the ground. We both got hurt. Can you get to the hospital? I don't know if they'll let us stay together. I need you to be there for Maddie. I'm on my way, I heard Shauna say as she backed up the car, her call going on speakerphone. Mommy is going to the hospital, honey, I told my daughter. I tried not to move so as not to hurt myself or her. Maddie nodded and winced again. The ambulance arrived, and 2 paramedics got out. One immediately ran to us, while the other went to get the stretcher from the vehicle. Tim, are you okay? Shauna asked on the phone. I don't know, Shauna. My focus is on Maddie right now. The ambulance is here. I'll see you at the hospital soon. I'm sorry, but I have to go. Please call Nathan and ask her to do the tracking. Brad stole my phone and keys. He probably stole my car. Okay, Tim, I'll take care of it. Take care of our girl, please. I'll take care of it, I said and hung up. Over the next 5 minutes, the emergency crew assessed Maddie. They brought a stretcher and began to examine me. Hopefully, they could get us both to the same hospital. The doctors suspected that my daughter had a broken arm and praised me for managing to shield her with my body. They loaded Maddie onto the stretcher and helped me onto the edge of the ambulance. The police arrived, and I was able to give some initial statements while the paramedics loaded us into the vehicle. They took us both to the emergency room of the local hospital. Once at the hospital, we were both examined by doctors in the same room. Maddie wouldn't let me go. About 15 minutes after we arrived, Shauna was brought into the room, and I breathed a sigh of relief when she went straight to Maddie before giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. After that, I lay down on the hospital bed, looking at Maddie, and smiled. I was ready to endure such pain 1,000 times for her safety. Shauna looked at me and, as always, understood what I was thinking. Thank you, she said, with tears in her eyes. You know I would give my life for both of you, I replied, trying to find a comfortable position. I closed my eyes, and after a moment, I felt a gentle kiss. Opening my eyes, I saw Shauna standing over me with tears in her eyes. I love you too, Tim, she said, and I smiled. Suddenly, I winced and then started coughing. Shauna screamed as I felt a new sensation of pain begin to grow in my side, and I began to lose consciousness. That was the last thing I remembered for 3 days. When I woke up, I was in a much more comfortable hospital room, and Rick was nearby. He heard me move. Hey, buddy, how are you feeling? He asked, looking me over carefully. Like crap. What happened? Is Maddie okay? Rick smiled. She's fine and will be back at school next week. She'll be the most popular girl in school thanks to her heroic father. I tried to laugh, but I felt a sharp pain in my side, and Rick noticed my grimace. The nurse said that if you are in pain after waking up, this is a medicine button. Use it only when you really need it. If you can stand it, don't use it. I tried to smile, but it didn't work. What happened? Rick tried to smile, but then his face darkened. Nothing too serious, the doctors said. One of your ribs moved too far with a fracture and punctured your lung. You had some minor surgery, but you'll be fine. A moment later, a nurse and a doctor entered the room. Rick stepped aside as they examined me. They said I was recovering well, adjusted my medications, and then left Rick and me alone. Any news on that idiot Brad? I asked. Rick smiled as he sat down on the edge of my bunk and pulled out his phone. This is from the night you and Maddie were brought to the hospital. It was a news story from the evening news in Sydney. Our big news today, the search is underway for Bradley Hatan. Earlier today, Mr. Hatan attacked local Byron businessman Mr. Timothy Otter. We cut to Byron Bay Hospital, where Mr. Otter and his daughter are being treated. Over to you, Carly. Thank you, Sharon, one of our local reporters said from our hospital's emergency entrance in the background. I met Carly Evans twice when she interviewed me about development in gaming. At around 11 a.m., Mr. Otter was attacked by now-wanted felon Bradley Hatan. Witnesses state that Mr. Otter was enjoying ice cream with a little girl identified as his daughter when Mr. Hatan attacked Mr. Otter. When Mr. Otter's daughter attempted to defend her father, Mr. Hatan tried to push her out of his way. Witnesses report that Mr. Otter jumped in front of his daughter, saving her from serious injury. Carly, Sharon, the news anchor said to her, "Can you tell me about the condition of Mr. Otter and his daughter?" "Yes, Sharon," Carly began. "Mr. Otter remains in a serious but stable condition following emergency surgery this afternoon, while his daughter suffered minor injuries and is expected to be discharged tomorrow." "What else can you tell me?" asked Sharon from the studio. "Sharon," Carly continued, "police say Mr. Hatan stole Mr. Otter's phone and car and was last seen heading south towards Newcastle immediately after the incident. It is unknown if Mr. Hatan is armed, however, police say he is potentially dangerous. If you see him, call Crime Stoppers immediately and do not attempt to apprehend him." "Good advice, Carly." Sharon paused for a moment, reading the note in front of her. "Carly, can you tell us anything about the reasons why Mr. Hatan might have attacked Mr. Otter?" Carly looked a little unsure for a moment, quickly glancing at someone off camera. She must have received a nod because she looked back at the piece of paper in front of her. "Yes, Sharon. There is some information about the reasons for the incident. Allegedly, Mr. Hatan was recently evicted from an apartment that Mr. Otter didn't even know belonged to him. The reason was that Mr. Otter's wife, Mrs. Bridget Otter, had long been cheating on him with Mr. Hatan, which Mr. Otter recently found out. Mrs. Otter is now separated from Mr. Otter and is helping the police in the search for Mr. Hatan. At the moment, Byron Bay is keeping its fingers crossed for one of its most successful businessmen, contributing over $70 million a year to the local economy, and his company, Otter Gaming, is being recognized for some of the most innovative games available online today, doubling this contribution to the Australian economy. We can only hope that it will recover fully." "We all hope so," Carly responded in her leading voice. "Keep us posted." She turned back to the camera. "And now for our Prime Minister, who once again finds himself at the center of an intimate scandal that has voters calling for his resignation." Rick paused the news clip, smiling widely. "He was caught yesterday in Wollongong after running a red light in your car. When local police spotted him, he removed his smile. Unfortunately, he crashed your car, but they caught the idiot. Don't worry about the car, I waved him off. I'm just glad they caught him and that Maddie is safe." We talked for another 15 minutes until we were interrupted by Maddie running into the room with Shauna, who was carrying Greg. "How are you feeling, Daddy?" Maddie asked as she climbed onto my bed, looking extremely concerned. "I feel much better, Princess. The doctors patched me up well, just like you," I answered. Maddie looked at the cast on my arm, then at her own, and smiled. "My doctor, Mr. Sweeney, said I was very brave," Maddie said with a smile, then became serious again. "But I told him that my dad was brave because you saved me." I smiled back. "Thank you, beautiful. I'm sorry it ruined our day. Once we're both better, we can try again. There are still waves with our names on them." This made my daughter smile, and we spent the next few hours talking about days at the beach and eating as much ice cream as possible in one day. Rick ended up taking the kids for a walk, leaving Shauna and me alone. "You really scared us all," she said, holding my hand. "Sorry, I didn't mean to," I replied. "I know. I'm just glad you're safe." "Me too," I replied. We talked for some time, then Naden and several people from my office came with cards and chocolates. When Rick returned with the kids, a couple of the chocolates may have disappeared, judging by the look on Greg's face. I spent just over a week in the hospital before being discharged home. The police questioned me and then arrested Bridget. It turned out that she was recognized as an accomplice. Brad explained during his interrogation, without a lawyer, that Bridget had expressed a desire to see me beaten for kicking her out and evicting Brad. It was just a coincidence that he ran into Maddie and me that day, and after hearing Bridget's words, he decided to take matters into his own hands. The trial turned out to be a straightforward affair, with Brad found guilty of several charges of assault, theft, and destruction of property. He was given 15 years in a mid-level correctional facility, with parole eligibility after 12 years. Bridget was found guilty of being an accessory to assault and was sentenced to 5 years but received a suspended sentence. However, if she is convicted of another crime other than speeding, she will have to serve the entire sentence. The judge also immediately approved our divorce, declaring that I did not deserve to be associated with a vixen like my second ex-wife. I surprised everyone when I offered to give Bridget $10,000 to help her start a new life, but on the condition that she does not do it in Byron Bay. While I was recovering, Naden worked with me at home every day, and Shauna was often there too. If you think that Naden and I became a couple, then you are mistaken. First of all, Naden was my executive assistant, and there's an old saying, don't crap where you eat. Secondly, Naden was married and almost 60 years old, not the combination that a young guy in his early 30s would want. However, during our work together, I got a new idea for an advertising campaign when I saw Maddie with her now heavily painted cast. One day, when Maddie returned from school, she was living with me almost all the time since Shauna was always nearby. It was logical, but now Maddie was overprotective of me. If anyone looked like they were going to argue with me, including her mother, Maddie would immediately come to my defense and give a stern stare. After I saw Maddie's cast, I decided that we would run a promotion in 3 of our most popular games. For every purchase of a package over $10 in the game, we would donate $1 to domestic violence charities around the world, specifically related to children. At first, my finance department was upset because, after expenses, that dollar was more than 30% of our profit. However, within a month, they were delighted to see their income growing. Marketing got involved, and Carly Evans continued the story, leading to our in-game purchases increasing by over 300%. We ended up donating almost $500,000 to 3 different charities in Australia, Poland, and South America. Now, every year, we hold a charity event to help those in need. As the months passed, Maddie and I recovered. Once the casts came off and my ribs healed, summer began, and Maddie and I returned to the beach. However, we were always accompanied by Shauna and Greg, and often by Rick when he could join us. Greg was now walking on his own, and Shauna enjoyed playing in the shallows with him while Maddie and I played in the waves. I had a great time that summer. Yes, I was a little lonely. I missed having someone by my side. Although Shauna was always there, even she understood that I needed a romantic companion. As the summer went on, Shauna and I talked about dating again, but my heart wasn't in it. The couple of dates I'd been on hadn't gone well. Either there was no spark, they were intimidated by my background, or, worse, they were just gold diggers like Bridget. I dreamed of finding someone like Shauna with whom I could have the same connection. Damn, I was only 31. I had a lot of time ahead of me. A year passed. I had a few brief interactions with Bridget, but they were abrupt, most often ending with me saying no. She either wanted money to return or, worse, asked me for forgiveness. Each time, I gave a negative answer and hung up. Little did I know that my life would change again, but not in the way I expected. I had just turned 32, and the office, along with Shauna and Naden, threw a birthday party at my house. I stayed in the house after the divorce because it was a really nice place, and I had invested a lot of money in it, so I planned to enjoy it. We had over 100 people that evening. I think I probably knew a little over half of them. There were people from work, some local business people I worked with, and even Carly Evans was there, but she was told it had to be off the record. My family was there, my parents, Bob and Tina, as well as Shauna's parents and a couple of Rick's relatives. Everyone had plenty of food and drinks, and with music playing, as the evening went on, I became slightly inebriated as everyone kept offering me more drinks. I had just seen Maddie run past, laughing with one of my cousin's kids, when I accidentally bumped into someone and muttered an apology. "Is that all you have to say?" came an indignant voice. I turned to the source of the not-so-sweet voice. "I'm sorry," I said to the woman standing in front of me. "You heard me," she said. "A simple sorry is just rude. You could have knocked me into the pool." Despite the aggressive tone of her voice and the frowning face that seemed dissatisfied with everything in the world, the woman in front of me was strikingly beautiful yet repulsive. She was quite tall, I guessed almost 6 feet, and I was 6'2" myself. She was slim but had very obvious curves in that floral jumpsuit. Her skin was pale, with a scattering of freckles across her nose that highlighted her sapphire blue eyes. But what really caught my attention was her red hair. It was long, braided almost to the waist, and had that scarlet hue like smoldering coals, which you could look at all night until they begin to glow with heat. You feel comfortable even if you don't say a word, just enjoying the warmth emanating from her. But at the same time, she pushed me away. There was a cigarette in her hand, and although it was not lit, it was unacceptable to me. The most beautiful woman in the world, whom every man, woman, and child on this planet considers the ideal human being, with a cigarette in her hand immediately lost her attractiveness in my eyes. This is exactly what was happening when I saw the cigarette in her hand. "Hey, dumbass," the woman said, bringing me back to reality. "Stop staring at me and tell me where I can be away from the crowd." No way," I finally answered. "There are no smoking areas here. If you want to smoke that death stick, you will have to go outside." She snorted. "Is it true that the owner of this house is so arrogant?" There was a note of contempt in her voice that made it clear she believed the non-smoking policy was wrong. "He is," I replied, taking a step toward the woman. She looked toward the fence on the other side of the pool, where no one was present. "I'm sure you won't mind if I smoke just one where there's no one around. Maybe there?" I looked at the corner she was talking about and shook my head. "No, ma'am, I don't think that's a smart idea. There's no smoking here, and there are kids around." She looked a little annoyed, but when she heard about the children, she began to put away the cigarette. At that moment, Maddie approached us with her friend and little Greg in tow. "Dad said you can't smoke, so you can't smoke," Maddie said in an authoritative tone. "Is this man your father?" the woman asked in disbelief. Maddie replied, placing her hands on her hips. The woman took a small step back, seeing that Maddie, her friend, and now Greg all had their hands on their hips in a gesture of challenge. "And everyone does what my dad says. If he said no smoking, then you can't smoke," Maddie said with a hint of sass in her voice. I thought I should intervene before Maddie got too excited. Even after all this time, she still stood up for me in front of everyone she felt had the intention of harming me. About a year ago, Shauna and I took her to a therapist. She had gotten into several fights because of me. Apparently, after that day with Brad, my daughter wanted to protect me from everyone, thinking that I might die if I got hurt again. I took a step forward to turn around and face the kids, but when I did, Greg thought I was going to step forward to deal with the woman in front of us. He was 3 years old, but with such an older sister, he had learned to defend his position and was quite noisy. When I turned around, he stepped forward and lightly pushed the woman. We didn't think about the fact that we were standing at the edge of the pool. During our short conversation, the woman stepped onto the edge of the pool, balancing on what looked like 3-inch heels. Greg's little push made her lose her balance. Suddenly, she was on the verge of falling into the pool. I noticed this and tried to grab her to hold her, but it was too late. With a look of absolute horror on her face, her eyes widened and she grabbed onto my arm, pulling us both into the pool with a loud splash. Now, I was no stranger to poolside pranks, and since it was my birthday, I expected to get thrown into the water at some point anyway. But whoever this woman was, she clearly didn't expect this. I surfaced laughing, but she emerged spitting water and screaming like a banshee. "How dare you, you little," and then she saw little Greg and stopped. "You can't be angry with a 3-year-old boy." Instead, she looked at me, laughing, but her face deepened into a frown. "And you? How can you laugh? There's nothing funny in this," she scolded me. "Of course there is," I replied, holding back my laughter. We fell into the pool. Classic slapstick. What's not funny? If you don't laugh, you might cry, so calm down, Karen. Karen, she looked at me. Who is she? She stopped when she saw the children laughing along with the other people around. Who is Karen? She asked. The cigarette she had wanted to light earlier floated between us, and a small air bubble formed on the surface and burst a moment later, making me smile at the woman. I watched as her face began to turn red and thought for a moment that perhaps I had gone too far. I saw the pool seem to drop an inch as the water evaporated under the heat radiating from that angry woman. FYI, mister, I'm not Karen. I just wanted to find a place to smoke away from everyone so as not to disturb anyone. She fell silent, looking at me angrily. Realizing what I had said, I smiled. I'm not Karen, she repeated. My name is Lily. Rick, shouted Rick as he walked over with Shauna and some towels. I could have guessed what you got yourself into here. Rick almost drowned when he saw the woman I now knew as Lily, unfortunately not Karen. I began to swim towards the edge of the pool now that the spectacle of the birthday boy falling into the water was over. Most of the guests turned back to their conversations, still chuckling. As Shauna watched me climb out of the pool, she laughed when she saw it was me in the water. Well, you ended up in the water a little earlier than I thought, but you still ended up happy. Happy birthday, water guy, Shauna said jokingly. I got out of the pool and took a towel. I dried my hair and turned around, showing Shauna my best blue steel pose. 2 little coughs, I said, throwing the towel over my shoulder and walking away like a male model. Shauna doubled over laughing at the reference, and I caught the words black lungs and water as the essence of moisture as she continued to laugh. I quickly turned around, struck a pose, and shouted, "Watch me turn left." As I did this, I heard several people laughing. Maddie and Greg, seeing their mother laughing, joined in the fun. Rick smiled and handed Lily a towel. Who was it? Rick asked. Lily asked, drying her hair with a towel. She still had a frown on her face as I stopped several times to talk briefly with the guests and share a laugh. He's the most smug, arrogant prick here. He wouldn't let me smoke. Damn, it's all wet now, Rick replied. This dear cousin was our host, the birthday boy. Tim, Rick answered, holding Lily's bag as she wrapped herself in a towel. You mean Tim? Lily asked, her eyes widening as she looked at me. I pretended to fall into the pool in front of a couple of guests, catching Lily's eye and smiling. Yes, Rick said with a big smile. Lily groaned again. I heard Rick laugh as I opened the door and headed inside to change. The rest of the evening was great, with the pool incident becoming a joke. Although little Greg did get a scolding for pushing, I also talked to Maddie about not getting into an argument without knowing the whole story. Later that evening, I saw her approach Lily and apologize. Shauna took Lily to the bedroom that she and Rick used when they stayed with me. Lily showered, and Shauna gave her a change of clothes. It didn't fit very well, but it would do while Lily's clothes were drying. Later that evening, as I was saying goodbye to Nain, her husband, and a couple of my coworkers, I saw Lily sitting down with Rick and Shauna. The kids were now watching a movie in the living room, with only a few people sitting in groups while the catering staff began cleaning up. I poured myself another Bundy rum and Coke and headed over to Lily, Shauna, and Rick. So, Karen, I said, sitting down in the next chair, do you throw these kinds of parties, or is it just for special occasions like birthdays? I'm not Karen, she corrected herself, smiling. Only for the birthdays of arrogant men who force their children to push me into the pool. I laughed. This child is not mine but theirs, I said, pointing at Shauna and Rick. Confusion appeared on her face. But I thought they were yours, she said. Maddie, that girl who came to defend my honor, is truly my daughter, but little Greg is the son of Shauna and Rick. Oh. Lily looked down at her hands. So you and Shauna, the question died on her lips. Yes, Shauna said. Tim and I were married once, and Maddie is our daughter. An expression of anger flashed across Lily's face, which was immediately replaced by deep sadness. She looked at Shauna. How can you, he's your ex-husband and he's so narcissistic. How can you be in the same room with him? There was a plea in her voice, as if she were holding back pain that she didn't know how to express. No one said a word. Everyone seemed to feel that the light conversation had suddenly turned into something very serious. Guys, let me take charge of this, Rick said, looking first at Shauna, then at me. We both nodded. I think Lily needs to hear it from the outside first. By the way, Lily is my cousin. She came from King's Cliff. He paused for a moment, searching for words. She has been going through a difficult time over the last few years. and the family decided it would be good for her to get away for a while. She arrived this afternoon, and I suggested she meet us here to meet a few people before she spends the next 2 weeks with us. Unfortunately, she did not have time to meet Shauna and the children before they arrived, hence the misunderstanding. I smiled. That explained a lot, but there was something else that remained unsaid. Lily, Rick continued, almost in a didactic tone, I guess you could say Tim and Shauna are best friends. I learned a long time ago not to be jealous of them, and I trust them both with my life. He smiled lovingly at his wife, then looked at me, and I raised my glass in gratitude. He sighed. I don't know how two people who were once married can remain friends like they are, but before you think anything, they have Maddie, and there has never been any doubt or reason for either of them to think that there is anything more than friendship between them. Lily opened her mouth in surprise and began looking at Shauna and then at me. Shauna laughed. It's a little strange and out of the norm, I know. Most ex-spouses hate each other, but Tim and I were friends before we got married. Yes, things fell apart, but he was always there for Maddie and me. I love him very much, but it's more like loving a very close brother. We both realized that we shouldn't have gotten married, but right next to my husband, Shauna looked at Rick lovingly for a moment. There is no man I trust more than Tim. I just sat there, sipping my drink. I had already laughed a little at this woman and began to suspect that there was something more to her story that I did not yet know about. But intervening now would be the wrong move. Lily remembered something and looked at me for a few moments. A couple of years ago, there was a case involving a business in which Rick was involved. It was on the news. It's you, right? I raised my glass and took a quick sip, contemplating my answer. Most people, when they find out what happened, either start to admire me or fish for information, trying to become my best friend. I looked at Lily, searching for words. Yes, it was me. That's why Maddie is so protective of me. We both suffered in that situation. I suffered quite a lot saving her. Now, every time Maddie thinks someone is attacking me, she rushes over and thinks she has to protect me. She's still worried that I got hurt saving her. And her brother is only 3 years old. He just wanted to be friends with his sister. When he pushed you, things just got out of hand, and I apologize for that. Lily didn't say anything but looked at me strangely, then nodded. Look, I said, if you really want to smoke in the corner, you can do it. There were just too many people here at that moment, and I didn't want anyone to see it, especially the kids. I finished taking another sip. Lily looked at me again. It's a pity that she despises the world so much and also smokes, otherwise, she could be very attractive. That would be nice. She stopped, tilted her head to the side, then sadly shook her head and sighed. No, it's okay. I know it's a bad habit that I fell back into recently, she trailed off, tears suddenly appearing in her eyes. She looked at Rick, then stood up and walked toward the corner. I looked at Rick, and he shook his head gently, indicating that it was a story for another time. When Lily returned to the table, it was clear that she had been crying. We discussed the series The Mandalorian from the Star Wars universe. Rick and Shauna weren't geeks like me, but they had gotten into a few shows with me over the years, and following Mando's adventures was one of them. I tried to convince Rick that Mando would have to fight other Mandalorians in the future for the Darksaber, but Rick didn't agree. This is the way, Lily said, surprising us, and it showed on our faces. I saw the first smile on her face and realized that underneath the shell of a woman ready to set the world on fire at any moment, there was real beauty hidden. Not for the first time, I wondered what had hurt this woman so deeply. I have spoken, I replied, using a phrase from another character that many of my friends often used in response. I watched as Lily tried her best not to smile but failed when Rick and Shauna laughed. Lily blushed, but they smiled, and I even thought she relaxed a little. Are you a Star Wars fan? I asked the slightly unbalanced woman. I'm more of a fan of science fiction in general, Lily admitted. I didn't even have to look to see the look Shauna was giving me. I just ignored it. Around midnight, the last guests left, leaving the four of us and the kids asleep on the sofas inside. We had all had more than a couple of drinks, so I put Shauna and Rick in their regular room with little Greg. Maddie, of course, got her own room, and Lily got the guest room. That night, as I fell asleep, I thought about the beauty who had come out of the pool in a white jumpsuit that had almost nothing. It's just a pity that she smokes. We spent the next couple of days at my house. Shauna, Rick, and by extension, Lily hung out at our place. We went to the beach, swam in the ocean, built sandcastles, and ate fish and chips. In general, if you closed your eyes to her slightly erratic behavior and the fact that she smoked, Lily turned out to be a good person. So, Lily, tell me your story, I asked late one afternoon as we watched Shauna play in the pool with Maddie and Rick with Greg. We had all already had a couple of glasses, and I involuntarily asked this question. Lily gave me an angry look. It's none of your damn business, the red-haired woman snapped. I raised my hands in surrender. Sorry, I didn't mean to offend. I just thought I'd ask because, well, you keep saying you want to smoke, but you never do. You seem to be on the verge of something, I remarked. You know a little about my past, which means you know that I was there too, more than once. Lily looked at me critically and angrily, then sighed. I lost my child, she said sadly. I didn't know what to say. This confession shocked me a little. Lily glanced at me briefly, then looked back down at the glass of red wine she was slowly drinking. It happened about 6 months ago, she began, moving on to the memories. I dated my boyfriend for a little over 6 months, and I don't know why, but I got pregnant, even though we used protection. When she looked at me, I didn't say anything but nodded in acknowledgement. At first, I was a little worried because we had been together for so little time, but in less than a week, I was happy with this thought. My boyfriend, Aaron, she trailed off. So we fought and yelled at each other, and when my belly started to grow, Aaron started coming home late and drunk. Lily took a deep breath, and her eyes became moist. He came home very drunk one night, and I told him he needed to start being responsible because he was going to be a father. She looked at me again, and I tried not to move so as not to interrupt her story. We argued and shouted at each other for almost 2 hours. He was drunk, and I was furious. I needed him sober and willing to help me while our child grew. Lily paused for a moment, gathering her strength. I've only told 2 people, she said very quietly. One of them is the policeman who interrogated me, and the other is the surgeon who later looked after me. I don't know why, but I'm going to trust you, Mr. Other. I nodded slightly in agreement. We didn't know it at the time, but our neighbors had called the police after hearing our screams. We both heard the sirens, and in his drunken state, he decided that I had called them and pushed me. Lily could not continue. I reached across the table and placed my hand on Lily's arm. She smiled at me with pursed lips, the pain of the memories visible on her face. I'm sorry, Lily. I'm so sorry, I said sympathetically, trying to hold back my tears. Thank you, she replied, and sighed again. About 2 days later, I lost the baby. I had to undergo surgery, otherwise, I could have been in danger. I'd like to think that it was a little girl, like you, Maddie, that she would be full of life and just beautiful. She took a handkerchief from her bag and wiped her eyes, then surprised me by handing me a fresh handkerchief. I took it and found that my eyes were wet, too. Lily continued once we had calmed down a bit. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Shauna looking at us, but she continued to play with the children, distracting them. So, Lily began again. After I lost my child, I fell into a deep depression. I was put on antidepressants as well as hormonal pills, most of which I had already finished. But as you've probably noticed, I can be a little harsh from time to time. I laughed, and Lily joined in. The fact that she wasn't offended told me that a little humor would be well received. And let me guess, you started smoking after a few years just as a way to cope? I asked, trying to make it easy to communicate with her. Lily smiled and nodded. My friends and I smoked at university. I know it's a dirty habit, but it distracts me from my thoughts, she said as if she had completed her story. Lily, do you mind if I hug you? I asked. She suddenly threw a fierce look at me. I feigned innocence. Please don't get me wrong, but I don't think a policeman or a surgeon who knows the whole story could hug you. Lily abandoned the glare, stood up, and walked around the table. I walked up to her, and she held out her arms like Maddie does when she wants parental comfort. I hugged her and pressed her to me. At first, She was tense as a board, but after a few moments, she relaxed and suddenly hugged me tightly as if breaking a dam. Lily cried, burying her face in my chest and sobbing loudly. I looked at the pool and saw Shauna and Rick watching us. Rick, in particular, had a frown on his face. I shook my head slightly, and Shauna tugged at Rick's hand, getting him and the kids to play to distract them. I led Lily to the couch, away from everyone. We sat down, and Lily continued to sob without raising her head, all the while holding onto my chest and squeezing my hands tightly. I wasn't sure what to do, so I just continued to hold her in my arms as if my daughter were upset. About 10 minutes later, Shauna and Rick pulled the kids out of the pool and took them inside. I smiled as they quietly passed us. Shauna gave me another questioning glance along the way, and I mouthed the word napkins. A few minutes later, Shauna turned with a box of tissues and a pitcher of water with 2 glasses, setting them on the table and heading back inside. These actions must have brought Lily out of her emotional state because she looked at the pool, then at me, then at the napkins and water. Her eyes were puffy, and the mascara she was wearing earlier was smeared. I took a napkin and wiped her tears, then poured her a small glass of water and handed it to her. "Here," I said. She took a quiet sip of the water, then settled back into my arms. "Are you okay?" I asked. Lily shook her head, then looked at me and nodded. "Yes, thank you. I didn't know I needed this." I smiled. "Everything is fine. When I was divorcing Bridget, Shauna did something similar. I probably even looked worse than you do now." Lily laughed, looking at the napkin in her hands. "She is really dear to you." "I mean, Shauna," Lily asked me. "She's my best friend. Always has been. Shauna and I have been through hell and back together, and when I really needed her help, she was always there," I replied. "Even during your divorce?" Lily asked. I felt like she was trying to find her footing by asking about my relationship. I nodded. "Even then." Of course, there was a lot of yelling. Although we have Maddie, we should never have gotten married. But in the midst of all this, I realized that I was better off with her than without her, just not married. "What about the other wife, Bridget?" Lily asked. I sighed. I don't want to admit it, but I married Bridget out of desperation. It wasn't the smartest thing to do, and if I looked at things soberly, I would never have done it. Bridget cheated on me for quite a long time. I loved her, or thought it was love, but all the evidence I collected showed that she never loved me. I was just a means to live. Lily looked at me. "I'm sorry to hear that, Tim. Despite the impression I made of the first degree when we first met, you come across as a wonderful person. Bridget was an idiot. Any girl would be happy to have you." I raised an eyebrow. "Any girl?" I asked. Lily nodded. "Yes. If only I could be like that." She didn't finish her sentence, and I just kissed her. For a moment, her eyes opened wide, then closed, and again I felt this hurt, angry, but beautiful woman melt in my arms. When we pulled away, we both smiled at each other, and Lily grabbed my hand. "It was unexpected," she said, smiling at me. I frowned, and she noticed. "But it's nice," she quickly added. "This is the way," I said, repeating my phrase. Lily giggled. For the next hour, while the sun was setting, we talked. We both delved into the pain of our past love relationships. She told me that her ex-boyfriend was now in jail on several charges, including assault and drunk driving. The evening he attacked her, he arrived home with almost triple the permissible alcohol level. Prison was a good place for him, she said. As the sun set and the lights came on, Shauna and the kids walked out of the house, followed by Rick with Mom's pizza. Pizza is fresh and hot, with homemade Italian sauce, fresh mozzarella, and basil on a traditional crust cooked in a real wood-fired oven, he announced. The conversation was a little tense for a few minutes, but Lily deftly overcame it by telling Shauna and Rick that we had discussed some pain from the past. She didn't go into detail, but she said enough to satisfy Shauna's curiosity. I knew Shauna would torture me later. After dinner, we all went inside. Maddie stayed with me this week, while Shauna and Rick took Greg and Lily home. The hug Lily and I shared was awkward, but there was a note of affection in it that neither Shauna nor Rick missed. As Maddie and I were getting ready for bed, she let me know that she had noticed it too. "Dad," my daughter began in a tone that told me she wanted to discuss something serious. I sat on the edge of her bed while she brushed her hair. "You like her, right?" my insightful daughter asked me. "I think so, Maddie. She's been through a lot, more than we have in some cases. But we've only known her for a few days. Let's give it some time. We don't want to end up in Bridget's situation again, do we?" Maddie chuckled. "I don't think Lily is anything like that." I frowned at her words. Maddie noticed. "Sorry, Dad. I wanted to say that that woman didn't deserve you." I laughed. Maddie was growing up fast. In a few years, there would be boys, and then watch out, world. "It's okay, Maddie," I said. Bridget and I smiled at each other. "But watch your language, please. What do you think about Lily?" Maddie bit her lip as she continued to comb her dark brown hair. "You're right, Dad. She doesn't look like Bridget. And Mom and I were watching you too this afternoon." "Oh, really?" I asked, grinning. Maddie blushed. "She likes you, Dad, very much, if Mom and I are right. But rest assured, Dad, I didn't have that strange feeling like with Bridget. But she is also broken. We all see that." "Yes, she is," I replied. "She's been through a lot in recent years, and none of it is her fault." "For example, what?" Maddie asked. "I can't tell you, baby. Lily told me this in confidence, and I will not betray her." I thought Maddie would argue with me, but she nodded curtly. With that, we went back to school and homework, doing what parents usually do, pushing their kids to get ready for the school week. Later, I was sitting in my office, checking emails and planning my week when Shauna called. "I don't know what you said or did, but this woman is absolutely fascinated by you," Shauna said, as if I were being reprimanded. "Well, hello to you too," I laughed, switching the connection to the Bluetooth headset and opening the schedule for our software spread for the next month. As Shauna spoke, I began rearranging tasks on the board in preparation for our development team review next week. "I'm serious, Tim," Shauna said in a conspiratorial tone. "Lily hasn't stopped talking about how wonderful you are, all the way home and right up until I called you. Rick says he's never seen her so devoted. Looks like her old boyfriend was abusive, and it ended badly." "That's true," I confirmed quietly. There was a pause on the other end of the line as I heard Shauna thinking about something. "She told you everything, didn't she?" she asked me. "Yes, she told me," I confirmed. Shauna said, "Maddie asked me this earlier, and I'll tell you what I told her. This woman has been through things that make our problems seem small and insignificant in comparison. But she also told me this in confidence, and although you are my best friend and I love you, I cannot say more." Once again, Shauna remained silent as I continued to stare at the task board in front of me. "So, do you like her too?" she simply asked after a minute. I stopped looking at the board and turned to the window of my office. It was dark outside, and little could be seen, although container ships could be seen passing in the distance. Their warning lights were visible as they bobbed back and forth. "Yes, I like her. She's smart, witty, loves science fiction, and doesn't mind that I'm a geek," I started. Shauna laughed. "And don't forget that she's incredibly beautiful." "I didn't notice that," I said, trying to hold back my laughter. We both laughed a little, making fun of each other. "Seriously, Tim," Shauna began to reason as we returned to the important conversation. "You like her a little more than just a passing fancy. In between talking about you, she asked me a lot about our relationship and also about Maddie. She's a little worried about you and me." I laughed. "She shouldn't worry. If there really is something between us, after talking with Lily this afternoon, with Maddie before, and with you now, I'm starting to hope that there will be life after Bridget." "She will," Shauna said seriously. "Do you mind if I bother you? As your first love and best friend, I have unique insight into either helping or scaring you." I felt Shauna raise her eyebrow. I thought for a moment. Lily was everything we discussed and more. I saw a beautiful woman who was afraid that the whole world was against her. Loyalty will never be an issue, but love, of course, Shauna, I replied. I don't know if anything will work, but I'll try. I didn't hear from Lily or Shauna for 3 days. Maddie was suspiciously silent, and at dinner, she glanced at me as if she was planning something. I just buried myself in my work and let my inner geek out. Wednesday night, I came home from the office to find Maddie, Shauna, and Lily sitting in my living room. Shauna and Lily were each holding a glass of wine, and I could smell something like carbonara, that distinctive and delicious white bacon sauce, wafting from the kitchen. I greeted the ladies and excused myself for a few minutes, going into my office to set up my work plan for the evening after Maddie went to bed. I wasn't sure where things were going with Lily, so I decided to play it cool. Tim, Lily said, entering my office. Dinner will be at. She fell silent, looking around. Her eyes widened when she saw my computer setup. It was an impressive multi-screen system, but unless you knew a lot about computer hardware, this was quite common for a geek like me. However, what caught her attention were the posters and awards on the wall. For almost 2 minutes, Lily looked at the posters and awards on the wall. Next to them, what was especially impressive was that I had a photo for each successful game and a frame for each award it received. It was a reminder of everything I'd built at other gaming, and I have to admit I felt a little proud seeing it there in my office. The awards were framed on the wall, but here in my personal space, I loved seeing the games I had created. I know this game, Lily said, pointing to one of the posters. I spent several hundred to buy bonus packs. It was a good game. Then she looked at another poster. And I know this game. How many hours did I spend trying to level up? She then looked at another game, took out her phone, and showed me that she had this game installed. This game helped me survive my time in the hospital. I love these puzzles. When everything was dark, I hid in these games. Why do you have these posters on the wall, Tim? I know that you work in programming. Do you work for the people who make these games? Open puzzle and look at the lower right corner of the loading screen, I asked in response, noticing the name of the game she was talking about. She did so, and her eyes widened. Other gaming? Is that you? I nodded. Years ago, I created other gaming, and all these games are my creations. You mean you're developing, you own a company in these games? She asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. I grinned. Since I was 19. So when you said Bridget was a gold digger, she began. I laughed again. Yes, I cost a little more than most, but to be honest, most of it has to do with business. I see, she said, drooping a little. I came to tell you that dinner is ready. Dinner was great. Maddie and Shauna let Lily in, and she made an amazing fettuccine carbonara in my kitchen, with fried garlic bread and topped it off with vanilla ice cream made with real vanilla. When we finished dinner, everyone was completely full. Shauna stared at Lily. However, Lily was surprisingly subdued despite the praise Maddie, Shauna, and I offered. After dinner, Shauna went with Maddie to help her get ready for bed, all the while telling me to talk to Lily. I poured us both a glass of a lovely local dessert wine. It was sweet and had a nice aftertaste, the perfect pairing with the ice cream. Lily and I sat on the sofa. Are you okay, Lily? It was an amazing dinner, but to be honest, you didn't look like you were enjoying it. Did we do something to offend you? I asked. No, Lily answered immediately. No, the thing is that she sighed and sank slightly onto the sofa as if deflated. Tim, Lily said quietly, with a hint of doom in her voice, have you ever been in a situation where you thought you could finally rise above all this crap? That you would finally find something worthwhile to hold on to? But then at one point you realized that this will never happen, that the gap is too big to bridge? I studied Lily for a while. I didn't quite understand what she was talking about, but I assumed it had something to do with our serious conversations about her past. I took a sip of wine. I think that, in a sense, my separation from Bridget was like that. I really loved her, and when I found out the truth, something inside me broke, something that still feels empty. I can't figure out how to fix it, but I know I should. It's my gap that I'm trying to overcome. Does this count? I asked her. Lily nodded. I think in some ways it is. She looked at me. "Tim, you are my gap." I laughed. It wasn't the right answer, judging by her angry look. "Sorry, I don't understand how I can be your gap, something that cannot be overcome." "Tim, I think we both know there's something between us. I mean that kiss." Lily smiled and blushed slightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I smiled too. "It was pretty wonderful," I admitted. She beamed for a moment, then lost that look and fell into despair. We spent a lot of time together over the last week. I met Shauna and Maddie. Rick took care of me. I recognized you, the man whose children pushed me into the pool at his birthday party simply because I wanted to smoke. She smiled telling this, and I smiled too. And that kiss, oh God, Tim, that kiss. I've never felt anything like that from a simple kiss. I didn't want it to end. I smiled at Lily again and put my hand on hers. She pushed it away, and I looked at her in confusion. "But tonight I saw in your office that you are a gap that I cannot bridge." "I cannot be." She fell silent. "To be who?" I asked in bewilderment. "Tim, I'm a nobody. I work in the administrative service of the local council. I'm from nowhere, and I can't compare with the social circles you move in." Lily looked at me, tears in her eyes as if her heart was breaking. "I make a little less than $60,000 a year. I'm broke, and I don't want to be a gold digger." Lily was on the verge of tears. "Sometimes I'm just slow." This woman pours her heart out to me, feels that because of my money I will consider her a gold digger like Bridget. She had been humiliated, had lost a child, and was angry, but for some reason, before she knew anything, she opened up to me. I suddenly realized what needed to be done. "Lily, come with me." I stood up, taking her hand, and we went outside. We walked hand in hand, and I felt hope emanate from her fingers gripping mine tightly as we walked down the path. There was no light, but at night, Lily embarrassedly muttered the same thing. We entered my room, closing and locking the door. I took Lily into the bathroom and took off her towel. Lily turned out to be a true redhead, with pale skin and freckles scattered across her face and upper chest. Her toned stomach and muscular legs spoke of many hours spent in the gym, most likely as part of her recovery in recent months. I turned on the double shower and pulled us both in. We made love, and then fell asleep. The next month was magical. Lily actually moved in with us overnight. It was a bit chaotic, and we decided to go on dates and spend time out of the house before coming home and having intimate all night. More than once, we woke up late, and Maddie scolded me for missing our morning meetings. However, I think she suspected something because she always had a smile on her face when she reprimanded me. Lily, for her part, took a job with the local council doing administrative work, just as she had in Kings Cliff. Her fear of not fitting into our social circles turned out to be unfounded since, being a geek, I tried to avoid all this glamour in social life as much as possible. The first time I had to go on a business trip just for one night in Sydney, Lily almost panicked. By this point, it had been several months since that first evening at the pool, and Lily was starting to get worried if I wasn't in bed by midnight, which, being the geek that I am, often happened. The trip and being away from our bed brought back memories of being alone. In the end, I arranged for her to take the day off and come to Sydney with me. I had my meetings, and she charmed one of the board members by introducing herself as my girlfriend. About 3 months later, we declared our love for each other after she pushed me into the pool before dinner. It seems that falling into the pool has become a common theme in our relationship. A year later, I proposed, and I don't think I've ever seen Shauna and Maddie so happy. Our wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in our backyard, with Rick as my best man and Shauna as my maid of honor. When we said yes and the master of ceremonies announced, "You may kiss the bride," the photographer was ready. As both Rick and Shauna turned to us and pushed us both into, you guessed it, the pool, the photos turned out great, capturing the smiles on our faces as we fell into the water holding hands. Our honeymoon was in Europe, and we spent almost a month traveling through several countries, sightseeing and visiting many places. Lily and I discovered that we were a great fit for each other. Yes, we sometimes quarreled, but we also discussed everything when the emotions subsided. I noticed that she was incredibly jealous of me, and the only women who could talk to me without angering her were Shauna, Maddie, and Nain. every other woman would immediately be faced with the angry redhead in a matter of seconds. If I was ever worried about fidelity after 2 previous marriages, 2 events that happened around our first wedding anniversary put all doubts to rest. The first incident occurred during one of the rare nights when Shauna and Lily went to a bachelorette party. They went to a local club with several women, some married, others single. All the women danced together, and the single ladies sometimes accepted invitations from single men. Neither Shauna nor Lily danced with any men. Shauna told me about this 2 days after everything happened. Seriously, Tim, you can't blame Lily. It's not her fault, she told me. Lily was on the phone with our lawyer. I went to the toilet for a few minutes, and as soon as I returned, the security guard told me that 2 guys began to pester her. When they wouldn't take no for an answer, one of them tried to force her out of the bar in front of the 2 ladies who remained at the table. Lily hit him, shouting over and over again that she was a married woman and her body belonged only to her husband. They could both get the hell out and burn in hell, something like that. A grin was visible on Shauna's face when she told me about it. The case was closed when CCTV footage from the club was shown in court. The judge sentenced the 2 men to 6 months probation, with a warning to make them understand that no means no. The second incident happened about a month after our first wedding anniversary, which we spent camping on Fraser Island in Queensland. Now I understood why the locals called great white sharks white pointers. Lily almost never wore a swimsuit top when we played in the ocean. However, I digress. The second incident occurred about a month after this. Lily met with Bridget, and about 60 seconds passed before Lily realized something was wrong. I never showed Lily pictures of Bridget. I never really described her. But Lily told me about the meeting that evening when we were lying in the pool. Rick and Shauna sat on the opposite side while Maddie and Greg swam back and forth, playing with the pool toys. I didn't expect this. I had just had a meeting with Bridget when she came in and sat down. I greeted her politely, but she just stared at me. Lily told me with an innocent look, and I felt very uncomfortable under her gaze. But like her reputation as a woman, Bridget did not disappoint. My wife continued telling me about the meeting with my ex. I see why he loves you, you're much prettier than he is, the woman told her. Lily blushed, thinking she was talking about me. Thank you, Miss Brown. I think my husband, Tim, really likes me, Lily replied. At that moment, the woman opposite frowned, then smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. Oh, I'm not talking about Tim, the woman said. I mean Aaron. Lily gasped. Why are you mentioning Aaron? How do you know him? She asked, already wary of the stranger. The evil smile on the woman's face grew even wider. Oh, Aaron and I know a lot about you. We've been tracking you for a while. After he got out of prison, I found him and convinced him that he needed to get you back, the woman said with a sarcastic smile. Lily was stunned. Aaron was part of her past that she had tried to forget. Why do you need this? I'm married now, Lily answered, starting to blush. I know, redhead, but you took my place, the woman growled, all pretense of politeness gone. Your place? Lily said, still a little shocked. The woman stood up. Yes, my place. I was Mrs. Other before you, and I want my husband back. Lily went from panic to anger. Suddenly, everything fell into place. Now Lily wasn't worried about Aaron. The woman who had caused Tim so much pain stood in front of her. Bridget, Lily said simply. Bridget nodded. Yes, it's me. Tim is my husband. Yes, I messed up the first time, but now I'll get him back. He liked this body more than yours, and I'm not broken over the loss of a child like you, Bridget said with contempt. For a moment, Lily thought she was going to attack her and strangle her. Apparently, Aaron told Bridget something, but my wife restrained herself, although it was not easy for her. She stood up from the table, grabbed her bag, and headed toward the exit. However, Bridget was not going to let Lily go just like that. When Lily came to the door, Bridget tried to attack her. I'm not done with you. Bridget screamed in front of everyone in the cafe, dragging Lily back to the table. You will leave Tim and go back to Aaron. I'll go back to Tim and have his children, and then all his money will be mine. There was a fight. Someone called the police. Lily told witnesses in the cafe, and one of them replied that he had already called. My wife leaned towards Bridget, almost whispering, "Listen here, creature. You had your chance, but you can't take Tim away from me. You should know that Shauna will make sure your body is never found if you try. And you know I'd love to help Shauna dig a grave for you, but I belong to him, Bridget, and not the other way around. And don't worry about the children. I was going to tell him tonight, but apparently you'll be the first to know. Tim has to become a father again. This morning, I received confirmation from the doctors that I am pregnant." Bridget groaned, and knowing how good Tim is at his job, I wouldn't be surprised if we had twins. At this point, the police arrived, and Bridget was arrested. Lily was questioned, but all witnesses confirmed that she acted in self-defense and simply neutralized Bridget. When Lily finished telling the story, she apologized for telling Bridget she was pregnant before she told me. I laughed and said it was okay. It just hit Bridget harder, and I was happy that my wife and our future children were okay. Bridget was released the next day, but was served with a restraining order prohibiting her from going near Lily, Maddie, Shauna, Rick, and, of course, me. We never saw her again, although a few years later we heard that she had married some criminal on the Gold Coast. This marriage did not last long, and she ended up in prison along with her husband and several other people. We later learned that Lily was not carrying twins. We had triplets. Early Wednesday morning at 3 o'clock, Lily went into labor. Connor, Adam, and their sister, Jessie, were born 2 hours later by cesarean section. Doctors did not want to risk complications. I was next to Lily behind the curtain in the operating room the entire time. My wife turned out to be a real heroine, and I loved her even more for it. I took 3 months off from other gaming to help Lily. A full-time nanny was hired, and we had Shauna, Rick, and Maddie supporting us. Little Greg, who had grown up by then, also helped as best he could. The first few months were somewhat of a routine. Lily nursed constantly, her breasts swelling to accommodate 3 hungry babies that required constant attention. I changed diapers, although I had not forgotten how terrible the first months were, and now multiplied by 3. The house smelled a little strange during those first years, but as with everything, we managed. Lily and I fought a few times when we were tired. One day, I even left the house and went to Shauna and Rick to calm down, but then we returned to each other. I can say that the night as a sign of reconciliation that night when the children finally fell asleep was unforgettable. Now our triplets are grown up, they are 3 years old, and we are again enjoying a regular Saturday afternoon by our pool. About 15 minutes ago, I threw Lily into the pool because she made a joke about how William Riker from Star Trek is attracted to all women and how I should be more like him and pick her up more often. I did so and threw her into the pool. She responded by grabbing my hands with a big smile and pulling me into the water with her, where we laughed and kissed. The children thought it was wonderful, and within moments, the whole family was playing in the pool. A few minutes later, Lily and I came out and sat next to Shauna and Rick. Shauna was still my best friend, and I couldn't have gotten through this without her. A few years later, Lily and I sat down and talked with Shauna and Rick about Lily's past, which Rick didn't know about. This made us even closer to each other. After a lazy Saturday afternoon, Shauna pulled out a deck of cards. While the kids continued to play, the adults got down to serious business. "She's cheating on you," Shauna said, leaning over and whispering in my ear as we both watched Lily from the other side of the table. For a moment, I almost panicked. The last time Shauna said those words to me, my world almost fell apart. But this time, I smiled. "I know," I whispered back. Lily smiled at me. I glanced over my shoulder at the large mirrored doors that reflected the view of the cards I held in my hand. The angle was perfect for my wife to see what I had in my hand. "He knows what's best for him," Shauna said. Lily grinned as she laid down her next cards. "He knows that if I win now, then later he will also be a winner," she said, giving me a knowing look. And yes, I can say that later I actually won, and even twice. What do you think of our story today? In my opinion, it was quite interesting, and I think that the wife's friend did the right thing by telling her husband the whole truth about his wife. What do you think about that? Let me know in the comments. See you in the comments.